What's up guys, Shadow here, coming to you from the Wolf Den with some more information on firearms and firearms safety. What we're going to be talking about today is the action of the firearm. Now we're not talking about Bruce Lee versus Jet Li versus Spike Lee. We're talking about the mechanism the firearm uses to actuate the trigger assembly, the hammer assembly, etc., and actually detonate primers and set off ammunition. As always, the first thing we did today was we removed all of the ammunition from the area. So all of the firearms we have out today I've already personally verified are unloaded, and all the ammunition is out of the room. Now, we'll be talking a little bit about the types of ammunition and the types of powder that are used and primers and things like that in another video. But what we're going to talk about today is specifically the mechanism that actuates the hammer or striking mechanism and actually fires the round. Early firearms utilized what's called black powder. Today, we use something called smokeless powder. The history is important there because smokeless powder is almost always loaded directly into a sealed cartridge, which is then placed into the firearm and fired via the striking mechanism, hammer, firing pin, etc. Previously, firearms required loading from the end, or muzzle loading. As we all know, the muzzle is the business end of the firearm. So you would actually have to load the firearm down through the muzzle with a ramrod, push powder and a ball and a patch and everything in there, and actually set up the chamber to be ready to fire. Now, historically, that took a long time. So what did they do? They invented a mechanism called a revolver. A revolver, which are these two items right here, is actually a type of firearm that uses multiple cylinders within this mechanism here, each one holding a specific bullet, powder, primer, cartridge, etc. Again, they used to be muzzle loading. You actually had to load each cylinder individually, but what this allowed you to do was to fire multiple shots without reloading. Now, with the advent of brass cartridges and things that were actually sealed mechanisms, you had the capacity to load things into what's called a magazine. You can see two firearms here on this side that are actually magazine fed. Most modern firearms that aren't revolvers are going to have magazines in terms of people. You can, however, still find single shot, double barrel, things of that nature that take more than one cartridge but don't have a magazine or a revolver cylinder. Once you start talking about firearms, there's really three major types of action. There's a single action revolver, a double action revolver, and a semi-automatic. Now, I have representative firearms here from pretty much each of those categories, and there's a few extra things we'll talk about, hammer fired versus striker fired, etc., later on in the video. But starting with our firearms, from this side to this side, we have a 22 caliber single action revolver, which is this one right here. Next to it, we have a 357 Magnum caliber double action revolver, which is this. This one here with the wood grip is the venerable 1911. It's relatively famous in firearms circles, and there's a lot of people out there who swear by them. And the one that's all the way over here on the far left is a personal favorite of mine, which is an HK P30L. Now, each one of these firearms is super cool to shoot, but they vary differently and widely in how you actually fire them. Within the firearms themselves, you'll see that there's a couple different mechanisms. Now, these firearms, everything I've brought today, actually has a hammer mechanism. So you can see the hammer is this part here that I'm pointing to. Some of these you can just pull the trigger on and they'll go boom. Some of these you can't. The difference is the type of action. With a single action revolver such as this, you can't just pull the trigger. So if I sit here and I try to pull the trigger, you'll note that nothing happens. The next firearm that we have on our list is this Ruger, which is a double action revolver. Now, unlike the single action revolver, if I pull the trigger, the firearm will actually cycle and will actually fire. Now, with a single action, to get it to fire, the first thing we have to do is we have to cock back the hammer mechanism. Get a good picture here. So, once you see the hammer's cocked back, firearm is now ready to fire. The reason that is referred to as a single action is because pulling the trigger does one action. It releases the hammer. If the hammer's not already cocked back, no boom, the firearm won't cycle. Double action, as we saw, you can actually pull the trigger and it will cycle the hammer back and release the hammer. But the cool thing about double actions is you can actually use them just like a single action. We can cock our hammer all the way back and pull the trigger. The venerable old 1911. Now we've gotten into our category of things called semi-automatics. A semi-automatic typically has a slide on the top. Now the slide, as we demonstrated previously, will actually cock the hammer back and prepare the weapon for firing. Now we can take our semi-automatic, pull the trigger, and the trigger will fall, or the hammer will fall. But if we try to go and pull that again, nothing happens. The reason is because the 1911 is what's referred to as a single action double action pistol, which is to say, on the first shot, you have to cock the hammer back in some manner. On every follow-up shot, what will happen is you'll pull the trigger, the slide will cycle, it will reset the hammer, and you're prepared for another shot. The cool thing about the P30L that we have on the left here is that it can function in single action or double action mode on the first shot. So if we take our firearm, put the hammer down, we can pull the trigger and the hammer will fire. Or we can cock the hammer back, and as we see, we're now in the single action mode. We can pull the trigger and the hammer will fire. So that's a quick rundown on the different type of action mechanisms that we have on a firearm and what they do. Again, going over all of these, we have a single action right here, which requires one action to cock the hammer all the way back and a separate action to release the hammer. We have a double action, which can be used as a single action by cocking the hammer all the way back and pulling the trigger, or by simply pulling the trigger the whole way through the cycle. We have a 1911, which requires cocking on the first shot, but since it's a semi-automatic, the slide will cycle, reset the hammer, and prepare you for a follow-up shot. And, last but not least, we have our HK-P30, which is a hammer-fired semi-automatic that can function in either single action or double action, and on every follow-up shot will function as a single action. So we've talked about the different mechanisms and actions of firearms, but one of the things I said I'd mention is hammer-fired versus striker-fired. Now, it's a strongly preferential situation whether or not you prefer a hammer-fired firearm or a striker-fired firearm. I can say that the vast majority of firearms that are on the market today are going to be striker-fired. Now, I've brought out another firearm, my 6-hour M18, which is a striker-fired pistol, to compare it to the HK-P30L. Now, we mentioned already that the P30L has the hammer, which sticks out the back end of the firearm. You'll notice that on the back end of the P30L, there is not a hammer. In a previous video, I showed that there was a little button in there in the 6-hour P365 that I had, which blocks the firing pin from hitting a primer and setting off a round unless you pull the trigger. The mechanism that's directly behind that in the firearm is what's referred to as the striker. The striker is actually something that gets partially cocked by the pullback of the slide and catches on a sear. When you pull the trigger, the sear trips or disengages, causing the striker to come forward. That hits the firing pin, which hits the primer, which detonates, which lights the powder, and then you got boom. The difference is On a hammer-fired weapon, the little hammer back here will either directly hit the firing pin, or it will hit a mechanism that hits the firing pin, which then hits the primer. It's 6 and 1/2 dozen the other. That's why I say it's definitely a preference thing. It's something that feels good to you. On striker-fired weapons, you'll see that there's a lot less parts on the outside that are moving, versus on a hammer-fired weapon where you have this additional nub that sticks out the back. Some firearms use what's called a hammer spur rather than a hammer, and that somewhat mitigates the risk of that hammer catching on something or getting broken off or what have you. Again, it comes down to preference. So ultimately, what feels good to you, what feels good in your hands, and what you're comfortable carrying and shooting. I hope this information's been helpful for you guys as you go to figure out what types of firearms you'd like to shoot. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below, and if there's something you'd like to see, by all means hit me up. As always, stay safe, stay shooting, have a great night. Bye.